A millionaire saw a waitress being humiliated by the manager. He defended her and decided to take her home for a night. The next morning, he was paralyzed when he saw what she had done with his little daughter. The grand estate in Greenwich stood in eerie silence, its vast halls bathed in golden light from chandeliers that flickered against the cold marble floors. Everything about Lawrence Bailey's mansion screamed wealth. Luxury cars parked in a spotless garage, an art collection that could rival museums, and a library filled with books he had no time to read. Yet, despite all of it, there was an unmistakable hollowness in the air, as if the house itself mourned alongside him. Seated in his leather armchair by the window of his private study, Lawrence swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. His gaze drifted to the city skyline in the distance, where the faint glow of New York's nightlights painted a stark contrast to the emptiness within him. The world outside kept moving, kept thriving, but inside this mansion, time had frozen 3 years ago, the night Emily died. 3 years. 3 years since the accident that shattered his life. 3 years since the laughter in this house had been silenced. Emily had been his anchor, his one true love, and without her, he had been left adrift in a sea of loneliness. But as much as his own grief tormented him, what truly broke him was the sight of his daughter, Stella, slipping further and further into a world of silence. She had only been 5 when it happened, too young to fully comprehend the depth of the tragedy, yet old enough for it to leave an irreversible scar. Once a lively, talkative little girl, Stella had become a ghost of herself. She barely spoke. She barely smiled. She spent most of her time curled up in her oversized armchair by the window, hugging the stuffed rabbit Emily had given her on her birthday, the last gift she had ever received from her mother. She would sit there for hours, staring at nothing, lost in a world Lawrence couldn't reach, and that terrified him. A soft knock on the door broke through his thoughts. He already knew who it was before she spoke. "Sir?" Julia, the housekeeper who had been with the family for over a decade, stepped inside cautiously. There was kindness in her eyes, but also worry. "She refused dinner again," she said softly. Lawrence set his drink down, exhaling slowly. "That was the 3rd night in a row. I'll talk to her," he muttered. Pushing himself up from the chair, Julia hesitated. "Sir, she barely eats anything these days." Lawrence ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion weighing down on him. "I know," he admitted. "I'll try." But he wasn't sure if he was trying for her anymore, or just trying to convince himself that there was still a way to reach her. The walk through the long corridors of the mansion felt heavier with each step. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors, a reminder of how painfully empty this house had become. When he reached Stella's room, he found her exactly as he expected, curled up in her chair by the window, staring outside. Her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly against her chest. The soft glow of the moon filtered through the curtains, casting a silver light on her delicate face. "Stella," he called gently, stepping closer. She didn't turn. He sighed, kneeling beside her. "Julia told me you didn't eat again," he said, his voice careful, measured. Still, nothing. Lawrence reached for the small chair beside her, sitting down so they were at eye level. He studied her face, searching for some sign, any sign, that she was still in there, that she hadn't completely shut him out. "Do you remember when your mother used to tell you stories before bed?" he asked. "She always said stories could help when we're feeling sad." For a moment, just a fleeting second, he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hope. But then it was gone, swallowed by the same silence that had become her shield. His heart clenched. "I miss her too," he admitted, his voice quieter now. Raw. More than anything. Still, no response. Lawrence exhaled, running a gentle hand over her soft curls before pulling back. "All right," he said, standing. "I'll be downstairs if you need me." And just like every other night, she didn't answer. Later that evening, as Lawrence sat alone in his study, staring at the untouched files on his desk, he felt the suffocating weight of reality settling in. This was his life now, a house filled with memories that haunted him, a daughter slipping further away, a silence he didn't know how to break. He couldn't stay here. The thought struck him suddenly, as if his body had decided before his mind could catch up. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat and car keys. He needed to escape. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he needed to be anywhere but here. The drive through Manhattan was aimless, guided by nothing but the desire to clear his head. He barely registered the city lights flashing past him, the blurred movement of people who had places to be, lives to live. And then, almost instinctively, he pulled up in front of a small restaurant he had never noticed before. It was modest, nothing like the high-end places he was accustomed to, but there was something warm about it. The glow of the lights spilling onto the sidewalk, the faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses. For some reason, he parked. For some reason, he stepped inside. At that moment, he had no idea that this small decision, this simple, impulsive act, would change everything. The restaurant was small, the kind of place where the air carried the comforting scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling butter. It was nothing like the upscale establishments Lawrence was used to. No valet service, no meticulously folded napkins, no overpriced entrees presented as if they belonged in an art gallery. Instead, it was lively, bustling with the sounds of clinking silverware, murmured conversations, and the occasional outburst of laughter from a table of friends enjoying their night. He almost turned around and left. This wasn't his kind of place, but something about the warmth, the simplicity of it, made him stay. He wasn't in the mood for luxury tonight. He was in the mood to feel something other than the suffocating emptiness that followed him everywhere. The hostess, a girl barely out of her teens, smiled politely as she led him to a table in the corner. He sat down, glancing around. The walls were decorated with old framed photos of New York through the decades, and the tables were packed with customers, ranging from couples on dates to families sharing messy plates of pasta. There was life here, something he had been missing for far too long. A waitress hurried past him, a tray balanced precariously on one hand. She moved quickly, weaving through the tables with practiced ease, but there was something in her expression, tension, exhaustion, as if she was barely holding herself together. She stopped at a nearby table to serve a couple their drinks. "Here you go, sir, a bourbon on the rocks," she said with a small, apologetic smile. The man barely acknowledged her, already engrossed in his conversation. "And for you, ma'am, the Chardonnay." As she set the glass down, the woman gasped. "Ugh, it's warm." The waitress flinched. I'm so sorry, I can bring you another one." "Unbelievable," the woman huffed, rolling her eyes. "You'd think a place like this would at least know how to serve wine properly." Before the waitress could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Michelle." The entire restaurant seemed to pause for a fraction of a second. A middle-aged man in a too-tight dress shirt and a permanent scowl stormed toward the table. The way he moved, puffed up, chest out, made it clear that he was used to throwing his weight around. Lawrence watched as the waitress, Michelle, visibly tensed, her shoulders tightening, her fingers curling slightly at her sides. "How many times do I have to tell you to stop screwing up orders?" The man, clearly the manager, snapped. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lewis, Sorry doesn't fix incompetence," he interrupted, voice rising. "You've been messing up all week. First, the wrong appetizers, then the spilled soup, and now this. Do you think this is some kind of charity where we just let you do whatever you want?" Michelle's face turned red, her hands trembling as she stared down at the floor, swallowing whatever protest she wanted to make. Lawrence could feel the growing discomfort around him. Other customers had stopped their conversations to glance over, some with mild curiosity, others with outright embarrassment for the girl being humiliated in the middle of the restaurant. And yet, no one said anything. They just watched, entertained or indifferent, as if this was just another part of their evening. Something in Lawrence snapped. He set down his glass and stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. The manager turned, narrowing his eyes. "And who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't particularly enjoy watching people get humiliated in front of a room full of strangers," Lawrence replied coolly, "especially when they're just trying to do their job." Mr. Lewis scoffed, unimpressed. "This is none of your business. She's my employee, and if she can't handle the job, she shouldn't be here." Lawrence took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. "And you think screaming at her in public is good management?" Michelle looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and something else. Relief, maybe, or disbelief that someone had actually spoken up for her. Mr. Lewis folded his arms. "Look, sir, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "Lawrence Bailey," he interrupted. The name alone was enough to make the man falter. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed closely by unease. Lawrence let that moment of hesitation stretch, then spoke again. "I don't run a restaurant, but I do run businesses, successful ones, and I can tell you this. No real leader treats their employees like garbage and expects them to perform well." Mr. Lewis clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He knew he had already lost whatever authority he thought he had in this moment. "Apologize," Lawrence said, voice level but laced with quiet command. For a long, tense moment, Mr. Lewis looked like he wanted to argue, but he was outmatched, and he knew it. He turned to Michelle, expression tight. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Michelle blinked, stunned. "That didn't sound particularly sincere," Lawrence mused. Mr. Lewis let out a breath, barely disguising his frustration. "I'm sorry, Michelle." Lawrence studied him for a second, then finally nodded. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like to order dinner, and I expect to be served by her." Mr. Lewis looked like he had swallowed something sour, but he gave a stiff nod before turning and storming off toward the kitchen. Michelle stood frozen, as if still processing what had just happened. "Are you okay?" Lawrence asked, his tone softer now. She let out a small, breathless laugh, shaking her head. "That was unexpected," she admitted. Lawrence smirked. So was this restaurant. For the first time that night, Michelle smiled. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment their fates quietly intertwined. Michelle still felt the heat of humiliation burning on her skin, even after Mr. Lewis had disappeared into the kitchen. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her notepad, forcing herself to focus on something, anything, to keep her composure. She had been yelled at before, insulted, belittled, but this time had been different. This time someone had stepped in. She glanced at Lawrence Bailey, still standing there, watching her with an unreadable expression. She knew his name. Who didn't? His face had graced magazine covers, and his company, Bailey & Co., was one of the most powerful in the finance world. What was a man like him doing in a place like this? And why had he defended her? "Are you sure you still want me to serve you?" she asked, her voice laced with weary sarcasm. "I might get your order wrong and end up on the street." A faint smirk tugged at Lawrence's lips. "I like to live dangerously." Despite herself, she let out a small laugh. The tension in her shoulders loosened slightly, though the embarrassment still lingered. She took his order. Nothing fancy, just a steak, medium rare, and a glass of red wine. Simple, efficient, just like the man himself, she supposed. As she walked away, she felt his gaze on her back, but she didn't look over her shoulder. The rest of her shift dragged on, but at least Mr. Lewis left her alone. Maybe it was out of fear that Lawrence would cause more trouble for him, or maybe he had just lost interest. Either way, she didn't care. She didn't. All she wanted was to make it through the night, collect her meager tips, and figure out what to do about her rapidly crumbling life. By the time she finished cleaning her last table, her body ached with exhaustion. Her shift was officially over, and the weight of reality settled heavily on her shoulders. She didn't have a place to go, not anymore. 2 weeks ago, she had been evicted from the tiny apartment she had struggled to afford, and since then, she had been bouncing between cheap motels and sleeping in the break room. Whenever Mr. Lewis wasn't paying attention, she told herself it was temporary, that she'd find a way out. But tonight, she wasn't sure where she'd sleep. As she pulled off her apron and grabbed her coat, she turned to find Lawrence still seated at his table, his plate now empty, his glass nearly drained. He had been watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with an expression that suggested he was still thinking about what had happened earlier. She hesitated, then walked over, crossing her arms. "Do billionaires usually spend their nights rescuing waitresses?" she asked dryly. Lawrence leaned back slightly, studying her. "No, tonight was a first." Michelle huffed a small laugh. "Lucky me." His gaze flickered to the worn-out coat she was holding, the tired slump of her shoulders, the dark circles under her eyes. He didn't know her, but he had spent enough time around people to recognize when someone was barely holding it together. "Do you have a ride home?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated a second too long before forcing a nod. "Yeah, I'll manage." Lawrence didn't believe her. "Where do you live? Why do you care?" There was no hostility in her tone, only guardedness, the kind of resistance built from years of learning not to trust easily. "Because you look like you're about to walk into the night with nowhere to go," he said simply. Michelle felt her throat tighten. Damn it. Why did he have to be so perceptive? "I'm fine," she lied, stuffing her hands in her pockets. Lawrence sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know why he cared, but he did. Maybe it was because of the way she had stood there, taking hit after hit from her boss without fighting back. Not because she was weak, but because she was exhausted. Maybe it was because she reminded him, just a little, of someone who had once been full of fire but had lost her way. "Do you have anywhere to stay tonight?" he asked, this time more direct. Michelle's silence was answer enough. Lawrence exhaled. "Come with me." Her eyes snapped to his. "What?" "I have a guest house. It's warm, quiet, and no one will scream at you for pouring a warm glass of wine." Michelle narrowed her eyes. "Are you in the habit of bringing stray waitresses home?" Lawrence let out a small chuckle. "Just this once." She stared at him, studying his face, searching for an ulterior motive. She had spent enough time around men to know when they wanted something. But Lawrence, there was no hunger in his gaze, no expectation, just patience. "Why?" she asked. "Because you need help and because I can help." It was that simple for him. Michelle wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him she'd be fine, that she'd figure it out, that she didn't need some rich man's pity. But she was tired. So tired. And for the first time in a long time, someone was offering kindness without asking for anything in return. She swallowed hard, then nodded. "Okay." A part of her couldn't believe she had just agreed to this. But another part, the one that was exhausted from fighting every battle alone, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was a chance she was meant to take. Lawrence signaled for the check, paid without hesitation, and led her outside. The night air was crisp, biting at her exposed skin, but for the first time in a long time, Michelle didn't feel completely lost. She had no idea that by stepping into Lawrence Bailey's car, she was stepping into something much bigger than a ride home. She was stepping into a fate that had been waiting for her all along. The drive to Greenwich was silent. Michelle sat in the passenger seat of Lawrence's sleek black car, her fingers curled around the fabric of her worn-out coat, trying to process what was happening. The heated leather seat was a stark contrast to the cold night outside, and the smooth hum of the engine only made her feel more aware of how out of place she was. Lawrence drove with the kind of confidence that came from years of being in control, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He hadn't spoken much since they left the restaurant, and Michelle wasn't sure if she was grateful or uneasy about that. She had no idea what she was doing, accepting help from a man she had just met, a billionaire, no less. This wasn't her. She had spent years surviving on her own, scraping by without anyone to lean on, letting someone, especially a stranger, step in and offer her a way out, even if just for one night felt unnatural. And yet, here she was, here. The car eventually pulled onto a long, winding driveway lined with towering trees, their bare branches casting long shadows under the glow of the streetlights. Michelle's breath hitched slightly when the mansion came into view. It wasn't just big, it was massive. She had seen wealth before, had served people with money, but this was something else. The house stood tall and elegant, its grand windows reflecting the soft glow of the interior lights. The place didn't feel gaudy or over the top. It was refined, almost intimidating in its quiet grandeur. Lawrence parked the car near the entrance and turned to her. "Come on," he said simply. Stepping out, Michelle hesitated for a second before following, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The cold air nipped at her skin as she stepped onto the stone pathway leading to the front door. As soon as they entered, warmth enveloped her. The inside of the mansion was just as impressive as she had expected. High ceilings, polished hardwood floors, and decor that looked like it belonged in an art gallery. Yet, despite its beauty, there was something about the place that felt empty, as if it had been stripped of whatever had once made it a home. A woman appeared from the hallway, her expression mildly surprised but not unwelcoming. She was in her early 50s, dressed in a neat uniform, her graying hair pulled back into a bun. "Mr. Bailey?" she greeted, her voice warm but professional. Her eyes flickered to Michelle, a silent question lingering. "This is Michelle," Lawrence said. "She'll be staying in the guest house tonight." The woman, who Michelle assumed was the housekeeper, nodded. "Of course, I'll have it prepared right away." Michelle shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to be a bother." "You're not," Lawrence said simply, then glanced at the housekeeper. "Julia, could you bring her something to eat?" Michelle shook her head. "That's really not necessary." Lawrence raised a brow. "When was the last time you ate?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Exactly." Julia gave a knowing smile. "I'll bring something to the kitchen." Michelle sighed, feeling both grateful and overwhelmed. Before she could process anything further, a soft sound caught her attention. Footsteps. Michelle turned just in time to see a little girl standing at the top of the grand staircase, peeking over the railing. She was small, maybe 7 or 8, dressed in pale pink pajamas. Her long, wavy brown hair cascaded down her back, and she clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. Her eyes, large, round, and eerily familiar, were locked on Michelle. Michelle felt her breath hitch. Lawrence followed her gaze and stiffened slightly. "Stella," he called gently. The girl hesitated, then slowly descended the stairs, her bare feet making soft tapping sounds against the polished wood. She stopped a few feet away, her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightening. Michelle wasn't sure what to do. She wasn't used to kids, but something about the way Stella was looking at her, curious, cautious, but not entirely afraid, made her heart squeeze. "Hi," Michelle said softly, crouching slightly to be at eye level. Stella didn't respond. She just stared. Lawrence sighed. She doesn't talk much. Michelle glanced at him before turning back to the girl. "That's okay," she said. "I'm not much of a talker either." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, in a movement so small it was almost unnoticeable, Stella stepped closer. Michelle remained still, not wanting to scare her off. She watched as the little girl lifted her stuffed rabbit ever so slightly, as if showing it to her. Michelle smiled. "That's a cute rabbit. What's its name?" Again, no response. But Stella didn't move away. Michelle's smile softened. "I had a stuffed bear when I was little. His name was Charlie. He was my best friend." A flicker of something crossed Stella's face. Interest, maybe. And then, to Michelle's utter shock, the little girl did something Lawrence hadn't seen her do in years. She giggled. It was small, barely more than a soft exhale. But it was real. Lawrence froze. Michelle blinked. "Did you just laugh?" Stella clutched her rabbit tighter, almost as if she hadn't meant to let the sound slip, but the corners of her mouth twitched, just slightly, and Michelle felt something inside her chest tighten. Lawrence was still staring. His expression unreadable. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost. For years, he had tried everything. Therapy, specialists, books on childhood trauma, desperately searching for a way to bring Stella back. And here was this woman, a complete stranger, standing in his house for less than 10 minutes. And she had done the impossible. She had made his daughter laugh. Michelle, still crouched in front of Stella, felt an odd warmth settle inside her. She had no idea why this little girl had reacted to her, why she seemed comfortable in a way she clearly wasn't with others. But in that moment, as Stella hesitated before stepping just a little bit closer, Michelle realized something. She wasn't just here for a place to sleep tonight. Something bigger was happening. Something she didn't understand yet, but she was about to, and it would change everything. Lawrence stood frozen. His breath caught in his throat as he watched Stella linger near Michelle. It was as if he was witnessing something unreal, something that shouldn't be happening, because it hadn't in years. His daughter, the same little girl who had refused to let anyone in since Emily's death, had just laughed. It was small, quiet, but undeniable, and it was because of Michelle. He wasn't sure what to make of that. Michelle, still crouched in front of Stella, met the girl's eyes with warmth, not forcing anything, not trying to push. She simply existed in the moment with her, allowing Stella to come to her at her own pace. The little girl reached out and gently pressed the rabbit against Michelle's arm, as if offering it to her. Michelle tilted her head. "For me," Stella hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Lawrence almost took a step forward, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It wasn't that he didn't believe in progress. It was that he had stopped expecting it. Michelle took the rabbit with exaggerated reverence, inspecting it carefully. Wow, he's really soft. And he looks well loved. Stella's lips pressed together, as if holding back another small smile. Lawrence cleared his throat. Stella, it's late. You should get some sleep. The little girl didn't look at him. Instead, she kept her gaze on Michelle, who handed the stuffed rabbit back with a warm smile. Good night, Stella, Michelle said softly. For a moment, it seemed like Stella might say something, but then she simply turned and padded back up the stairs, hugging the rabbit tightly against her chest. Michelle slowly stood, watching her disappear down the hall before turning to Lawrence. She's incredible, she murmured. Lawrence let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. You have no idea. Julia, who had quietly returned from the kitchen, broke the moment. There's some food ready for you, dear. Michelle hesitated before nodding. Thank you. Lawrence motioned for her to follow, leading her down a corridor toward a smaller, cozier dining area that contrasted with the grand formal one he rarely used. A plate of pasta, still steaming, sat on the table, along with a glass of water and a neatly folded napkin. Michelle sat down, glancing up at him warily. You really didn't have to do all this. Lawrence pulled out a chair across from her and sat. I don't do things I don't want to do. She let out a small scoff, twirling her fork into the pasta. Right, billionaire rule of thumb, I'm guessing. Something like that, he said, watching as she took her first hesitant bite, the way she closed her eyes briefly, exhaling softly as if the warmth of the food seeped into her bones. Didn't go unnoticed. How long has it been since you had a real meal? He asked. Michelle swallowed and shrugged. Depends on what you consider real. Lawrence didn't press. He already knew the answer. For a while, they sat in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound between them. Then, finally, Michelle set down her fork and leaned back slightly. Okay, she said, meeting his gaze. What's your deal? Lawrence raised a brow. My deal? She gestured vaguely. Rich, powerful man takes in struggling waitress, gives her food, offers her a place to stay. Sounds like the beginning of a very specific kind of story. He smirked. And what kind of story do you think this is? The kind where people expect something in return. Lawrence leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. I don't. Michelle studied him carefully, looking for cracks in his composure, some hidden agenda lurking beneath the surface. But all she saw was calm certainty. She exhaled. Okay, let's say I believe that. You should. She shook her head, chuckling softly. You really are a billionaire, aren't you? I've been told. Michelle tilted her head. So, why are you doing this? Lawrence considered his answer for a moment. Because my daughter just laughed for the first time in 3 years. Michelle's smile faded slightly. He met her gaze, steady and unwavering. She doesn't do that. She barely speaks. She barely reacts. And yet, tonight, with you, He trailed off, inhaling deeply before finishing. She came alive. Michelle swallowed, suddenly feeling the weight of what had just happened. I don't know why, Lawrence continued, but for some reason, Stella connected with you in a way she hasn't with anyone else. She looked away, shifting in her seat. Maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe, he admitted, but I can't ignore it. Michelle hesitated, staring down at her hands. What are you asking? Lawrence exhaled. Stay. Her head snapped up. What? Stay here. At least for a little while. You don't have to work for me. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Just be here. Be around Stella. Michelle's pulse quickened. That's insane. Is it? Yes. She let out a short laugh. I don't know anything about kids. I've never been a nanny. I'm not asking you to be a nanny, Lawrence interrupted gently. I'm asking you to be you, because whoever you are, whatever it is about you that made Stella laugh tonight, that's something I can't ignore. Michelle stared at him, her mind racing, every instinct she had told her to say no, to run, to not get involved. And yet, she had seen Stella's face. She had seen that tiny, hesitant spark of joy, and she had felt something deep and unfamiliar, when it happened. Something she didn't want to walk away from. She exhaled, shaking her head. You're really serious about this? Lawrence nodded. Michelle closed her eyes for a moment, weighing the decision. Then finally, she opened them and met his gaze. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." And just like that, a door had been opened. One she couldn't close, and one that would change both of their lives forever. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the guest house, casting golden streaks across the plush carpet and the neatly made bed where Michelle had slept for the first time in weeks without waking up in the middle of the night, cold and restless. For the first time in what felt like forever, she hadn't been haunted by the nagging question of where she'd sleep the next day, of how she'd scrape together enough money for a cheap motel or a bus ride to nowhere. She stretched, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of warmth and comfort enveloping her, then immediately shook it off. This wasn't her life. This wasn't her world. It was just temporary. She repeated that to herself as she pulled on a fresh change of clothes from the small duffel bag she had brought with her, one of the few things she still owned after losing her apartment. Her fingers traced the worn fabric of her hoodie, a stark contrast to the expensive elegance surrounding her. The guest house was bigger than any place she had ever lived in, with its polished wooden floors, high ceilings, and carefully curated decor that looked like it belonged in a lifestyle magazine. It felt unreal. And then there was the man himself, Lawrence Bailey. She still wasn't sure what to make of him. He was guarded, controlled, and yet, last night, there had been something raw in his eyes when he talked about Stella. He wasn't just some billionaire throwing money at a problem. He was a father desperate to reach his daughter. And for some reason, for reasons Michelle still didn't understand, Stella had responded to her. That alone was enough to make her uneasy. She wasn't a miracle worker. She wasn't anyone special. So why did she feel like she had just stepped into something bigger than herself? A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Michelle hesitated before crossing the room and opening it. Julia stood on the other side, holding a neatly arranged breakfast tray. "Good morning, dear," she greeted with a kind smile. "I thought you might like something to eat before heading inside." Michelle blinked. Inside. The main house. "Mr. Bailey is expecting you." Right. She had agreed to stay. Michelle forced a polite smile and took the tray, balancing it carefully. "Thank you, but I could have come to the kitchen. You didn't have to." "Nonsense," Julia interrupted with a gentle wave of her hand. "You're a guest here." Michelle bit her tongue. She wasn't sure what she was, but she knew she wasn't just a guest. Guests didn't arrive at mansions with nowhere else to go. Still, she murmured her thanks and set the tray down before Julia excused herself, leaving Michelle alone once more. 15 minutes later, she found herself walking toward the main house, the crisp morning air cooling her skin. The door was already open when she reached it, and she hesitated briefly before stepping inside. She hadn't taken a good look at the place the night before, too exhausted to absorb much, but now, in the daylight, she couldn't ignore the grandeur, the high ceilings, the intricate detailing on the walls, the expensive paintings, the perfectly arranged furniture. Everything was pristine, carefully maintained, and yet, despite all its beauty, there was something lifeless about it. Michelle wondered if that was how Lawrence felt too. She was still glancing around when she heard small, rapid footsteps echoing from the hallway. A second later, Stella appeared, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Michelle paused. The little girl didn't say anything, just stared at her with wide, curious eyes. Then, to Michelle's surprise, she took a step closer, and then another, until she was standing just a few feet away. Watching her like she was trying to solve a puzzle, Michelle crouched slightly. "Morning, kiddo." Stella didn't respond. Instead, she lifted her rabbit again, holding it out the same way she had the night before. Michelle smiled. "Still taking care of him, huh?" Stella nodded, and then, slowly, she reached out and placed the rabbit in Michelle's hands. Michelle blinked. "You're letting me borrow him." Stella nodded again. A lump formed in Michelle's throat. She wasn't sure why. Before she could say anything else, Lawrence's voice came from down the hall. "Stella." The girl quickly stepped back, her expression unreadable. Lawrence appeared a second later, his gaze flickering between them before settling on his daughter. He looked almost cautious, like he was afraid of breaking whatever fragile connection was forming between them. He knelt beside Stella, his voice softer now. "Julia made pancakes. Do you want some?" For a moment, Stella didn't move. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the kitchen, her steps light, unhurried. Lawrence exhaled and straightened, glancing at Michelle. She's never done that before. Never done what? Approach someone first, he said quietly, given them her rabbit. Michelle held the stuffed animal a little tighter. It's just a rabbit. No, Lawrence murmured. It's not. They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then, as if shaking himself from a thought, Lawrence gestured toward the dining room. Come eat, he said. We need to talk. Michelle followed him, unsure of what conversation awaited her, but knowing, deep down, that whatever it was, it would be important. She had stepped into something she didn't understand, and there was no turning back now. Michelle followed Lawrence through the long, elegant hallway, the quiet weight of the moment pressing down on her. The mansion felt too big, too grand for the kind of life she had always known. Everything in it was polished, pristine, untouched almost. A place meant to be lived in but somehow frozen in time, stuck in a past that no one wanted to talk about. They entered the dining room, where Julia had already set the table with plates of pancakes, fresh fruit, and steaming cups of coffee. The scent of maple syrup and butter filled the air, warm and inviting. Yet Michelle felt slightly out of place as she hesitated at the threshold. Lawrence sat down at the head of the table, his movements composed as ever. Stella was already in her chair, swinging her small feet under the table. Nibbling cautiously at a piece of fruit, Michelle's eyes lingered on the little girl, still holding onto the stuffed rabbit she had let her borrow moments before. Stella seemed at ease, or at least as close to it as a child like her could be. There was no fear in her posture, no hesitation. Taking a deep breath, Michelle finally pulled out a chair and sat down. Coffee? Lawrence asked, his voice even. She nodded, and Julia poured her a cup, the rich aroma filling her senses as she wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic. She wasn't used to this, being served, sitting at a table like this, the last time she had a meal this put together. She'd been a kid, sitting at a small, wobbly kitchen table with her mother, both of them sharing a single plate of eggs and toast because it was all they could afford that day. Now, here she was, across from one of the richest men in the city, eating pancakes on fine china. It felt surreal. Lawrence cut into his food with quiet precision, not speaking for a few moments. It wasn't an awkward silence, but rather the kind that lingered when two people were trying to figure out where they stood with each other. You slept well? He finally asked, his eyes flickering to her over the rim of his coffee cup. Michelle nodded. Yeah. She hesitated before adding, better than I have in a while. She didn't know why she admitted that, but it was the truth. Lawrence nodded slightly as if filing the information away. You don't have to sit here if you don't want to, he said suddenly, his tone surprisingly casual. If eating with us makes you uncomfortable, Julia can set up something for you in the guest house. Michelle frowned. Why would it make me uncomfortable? Lawrence tilted his head slightly. Because you don't like feeling like you owe anyone anything. She blinked. He wasn't wrong. She exhaled, setting down her fork. Look, I appreciate the food and the place to sleep, but let's be clear. I don't expect this to be permanent. Lawrence's gaze didn't waver. I never said it had to be. Michelle narrowed her eyes slightly, trying to read him. He was hard to pin down. A man who kept everything close to his chest, revealing only what he wanted others to see. So why am I here? She asked finally. What do you really want from me? Lawrence leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I already told you. Yeah, I know. Stella laughed. Michelle said, glancing at the little girl, who was still quietly picking at her breakfast. But you're acting like I'm some kind of... She paused, shaking her head. I don't know what you think I am. I think you're someone my daughter is responding to, Lawrence said simply. Michelle let out a slow breath, pushing her plate away. You keep saying that, but I don't know why. I don't know anything about kids. Lawrence, I've never taken care of one, never even been around them much. And yet, Stella lets you near her. Michelle glanced at the girl again, watching as she carefully arranged pieces of fruit into small patterns on her plate. She's a kid, Michelle muttered. Maybe I was just new and interesting for a night. Maybe, Lawrence agreed. But I can't take that chance. Michelle looked at him, searching his face. And what happens if it stops? If she wakes up tomorrow and doesn't want me around anymore, if she doesn't laugh again, Lawrence exhaled, as if considering that possibility, then at least I'll know I tried. His honesty caught Michelle off guard. He wasn't pretending to have all the answers. He wasn't trying to convince her that this was some grand plan with a guaranteed outcome. He was just a father grasping at whatever hope he could find. Michelle swallowed hard. You really love her, don't you? Lawrence's expression softened. Just barely, but enough. More than anything. Michelle looked away, something twisting in her chest. She didn't know what it was like to have a father who would do anything for her. She didn't know what it was like to be someone's first priority. And yet, sitting here, watching the way Lawrence looked at Stella, so much quiet devotion in his eyes, she felt something unfamiliar. Something she wasn't sure she wanted to name. Stella suddenly reached across the table, tugging gently at Michelle's sleeve. Michelle turned, surprised. The little girl pointed at her plate, then at Michelle's, her lips pressing together as if trying to form words. Michelle frowned. You want me to eat more? Stella nodded. Michelle blinked. Then, despite herself, she let out a small chuckle. Bossy, she muttered, picking up her fork again. From across the table, Lawrence watched the exchange with something close to relief. For the first time in a long time, there was movement, however small, in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't completely drowning in hopelessness. Michelle didn't know why she had agreed to stay. She didn't know what she was doing here, sitting in a mansion, eating breakfast with people who existed in an entirely different world from hers. But what she did know, what she was slowly beginning to accept, was that something about this felt right, and that terrified her more than anything else. The day stretched on in a way Michelle hadn't anticipated. She had expected to feel out of place, uncomfortable in a house filled with wealth and quiet luxury. But instead, there was an odd stillness that settled around her. It wasn't peace. Peace was something she had never really known, but it was the closest she had felt to it in years. After breakfast, Lawrence had disappeared into his office, leaving Michelle alone with Stella, which had been unexpected. She wasn't sure if he had done it on purpose, testing some theory he had about Stella's sudden connection to her, or if he was simply trusting her to be around his daughter. Either way, she found herself sitting on the living room floor, watching as Stella carefully lined up a set of colored pencils in perfect order. Michelle pulled her knees to her chest. You're really into making things neat, huh? Stella glanced up at her, then looked back down at her arrangement. Nudging a blue pencil a fraction of an inch to the right, Michelle smirked. Perfectionist, got it? Stella didn't respond, but she also didn't move away. That alone felt like a win. It was strange, how easily she had settled into this dynamic with the little girl. She had never spent much time around kids before, had never thought of herself as someone who knew how to interact with them. And yet, there was something about Stella, her quiet nature, the way she observed the world with cautious curiosity, that made Michelle want to understand her. Julia passed by the room, watching the scene unfold with mild amusement. She didn't say anything, but Michelle could sense the approval in her gaze. Later in the afternoon, when Stella had retreated upstairs for a nap, Michelle found herself wandering toward the back of the house, drawn to the massive windows that overlooked the sprawling garden. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, exhaling softly as she took in the view. The place was beautiful. There was no denying that, but it was lonely. She wondered if it had always been this way or if it had only become like this after Emily's death. The thought sent an unexpected pang through her chest. She didn't know much about Lawrence's late wife, only what she had pieced together from the brief mentions and the weight that seemed to settle over him whenever Stella was brought up. But she knew grief when she saw it, and Lawrence Bailey carried his like a permanent scar. She turned away from the window, shaking off the thought. It wasn't her business. As she made her way down the hallway, she passed by Lawrence's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear his voice, low and measured. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something in his tone made her pause. I don't care how long it takes, he said, his voice tight with restrained frustration. Find out everything. There was a pause, and then, yes, her mother. I want the full report. Michelle felt her stomach twist. Her mother. A chill ran down her spine. She stepped away before she could hear anything else. her pulse quickening as she moved down the hallway. Why was Lawrence investigating her mother? It didn't make sense. He had no reason to, unless... No. Michelle stopped in the middle of the hall, pressing a hand against her temple. She was overthinking this. She had to be. Lawrence was a businessman. Maybe he was just being cautious, making sure she wasn't some kind of threat before letting her near his daughter. That would make sense. And yet, something about it didn't sit right. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to keep walking, ignoring the uneasy feeling curling in her stomach. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over again in her head. She hadn't thought about her mother in a long time. It wasn't because she had forgotten her. How could she? But because thinking about her always led to the same ache in her chest, the same unanswered questions. She had been young when she lost her, too young to understand why things had happened the way they did, why her mother had left that night and never come back. The official story had been an accident, a tragic, untimely death, but the truth, Michelle had always felt like there was more to it. And now, hearing Lawrence say her mother's name in a way that made it sound like a puzzle he was trying to solve, she couldn't help but wonder if he knew something she didn't. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. Whatever it was, she wasn't ready to ask. Not yet, but she had a feeling that sooner or later she wouldn't have a choice. The morning felt different. Maybe it was the weight of what Michelle had overheard, or maybe it was the unsettling feeling that she was walking blindfolded into something much bigger than she could comprehend. Either way, when she stepped into the main house, there was a tightness in her chest that hadn't been there the day before. Lawrence was already at the dining table, sipping his coffee as he read through a document, his usual air of quiet authority settling over the room. Julia moved gracefully between the kitchen and the table, setting down fresh fruit and warm toast with the efficiency of someone who had done this for years. And then there was Stella, curled up in her chair, absently twirling the edge of the tablecloth between her fingers. She wasn't eating, but she wasn't entirely withdrawn either. It was progress. Michelle slid into the seat across from her, eyes flickering to Lawrence. He looked up briefly, offering a polite nod, but there was something else in his gaze, something unreadable. She hesitated before speaking. "Busy morning." "Always," he replied, setting his paper aside. "You?" Michelle shrugged, reaching for a piece of toast. "Still trying to get used to waking up in a house that doesn't smell like burnt coffee and regret?" A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Julia makes a better breakfast than your old place, I take it?" "Oh, absolutely." She took a bite, chewing slowly. Before glancing at Stella, "What about you, kiddo? You like Julia's cooking?" Stella looked up at her, blinking those large, curious eyes. Then, after a beat, she gave the smallest nod. Michelle smiled. "Good, because I was starting to think she was feeding me the fancy stuff and giving you the boring stuff." A flicker of amusement crossed Stella's face. Barely there, but it was enough to make Michelle's chest tighten. Lawrence observed the interaction silently, something shifting in his expression, though he didn't say anything. The meal continued in a quiet, easy rhythm, but Michelle couldn't shake the gnawing thought in the back of her mind. The conversation she had overheard the night before wouldn't leave her alone. She needed answers. She waited until breakfast was over, until Julia had taken Stella upstairs to get dressed for the day before she finally spoke. "So," she said, leaning back in her chair, "are you always in the habit of investigating people who stay in your guest house?" Lawrence didn't look surprised. If anything, he seemed like he had been expecting the question. "I like to know who's around my daughter," he said simply. Michelle crossed her arms. "That's not what you were looking into." Lawrence studied her for a moment before exhaling, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "No, it's not." "Then what?" she pressed, her pulse quickening. "Why were you asking about my mother?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression, something cautious. "I had my reasons," he said. Michelle clenched her jaw. "That's not an answer." Lawrence leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Do you trust me?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to say no, to say that she barely knew him, that trust wasn't something she handed out easily. But then she thought about Stella, about the way he looked at his daughter, about the way he was trying so desperately to bring her back from whatever dark place she had disappeared into. And she realized that, despite everything, She did trust him. At least, a little. She let out a slow breath. I don't know yet. Lawrence nodded as if that answer was enough for now. I'm looking into something, he admitted. Something I don't fully understand yet, and when I do, I'll tell you. Michelle frowned. Why not now? Because I don't have the full truth yet, he said, his voice calm but firm. And I don't want to give you half of a story. She hated that answer. Hated the way it left her dangling between knowing and not knowing, between trust and suspicion. But she also knew he wasn't going to budge. Fine, she muttered, pushing back her chair. But just so you know, if you find something and you don't tell me, she met his gaze, steady and unwavering. I walk. Lawrence didn't flinch. Fair enough, he said. The tension between them was thick, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Michelle turned, ready to leave the room, to put distance between herself and the questions clawing at the back of her mind. But just as she reached the doorway, Stella's voice, soft and barely above a whisper, stopped her. Michelle. It was the first time she had said her name. Michelle's breath caught. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Stella stood at the top of the stairs, her small fingers gripping the railing, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her arm. She hesitated for a second before taking a step forward. Stay. The single word was barely there, so quiet that Michelle almost wasn't sure she had heard it. But the way Lawrence's eyes widened, the way his entire body seemed to still, told her that she hadn't imagined it. Michelle swallowed. She didn't know what was happening here. She didn't know what she had walked into, what part she was supposed to play in all of this. But as she looked at Stella, at the hope in those wide, uncertain eyes, she realized something. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to walk away after all. Michelle had never been one to freeze up, but something about hearing Stella say her name, hearing her speak at all, made her feel as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. The little girl had barely made a sound in 3 years, yet here she was, standing at the top of the stairs, looking at her with cautious hope, asking her to stay. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, stunned, but when she finally found her voice, it was softer than she expected. I'm here. Kiddo. Stella didn't move, but her grip on the wooden railing relaxed just slightly, as if those words had been enough to settle something inside her. Lawrence had remained silent, watching the interaction with a carefully controlled expression, but Michelle could feel the tension rolling off him. This moment, this fragile, unexpected breakthrough, was something he hadn't dared to hope for. Michelle swallowed, trying to ground herself in reality. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't trained for this. But somehow, Stella had let her in, had cracked open the shell she had spent years building, and Michelle had no idea what to do with that. Before she could say anything else, Julia appeared at the top of the stairs, placing a gentle hand on Stella's shoulder. Why don't we go get dressed, sweetheart? She said softly. Michelle will still be here when you come back down. Stella hesitated, glancing between Julia and Michelle, then finally nodded before turning and walking down the hallway. Michelle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding when she finally turned to face Lawrence. His gaze was locked onto her, unreadable, yet intense. You understand what just happened, don't you? He asked. Michelle crossed her arms, shifting her weight. She said my name. Lawrence shook his head slightly. No, she asked you to stay. Something about the way he said it made Michelle's chest tighten. She swallowed hard. It doesn't mean anything. She hasn't spoken in 3 years, Michelle. I know, she said quickly, rubbing her arms as if trying to shake off the weight of the moment. But maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe she's just comfortable around me for now. Lawrence exhaled, leaning against the back of one of the dining chairs. You don't have to do this. Her head snapped up. Do what? Stay. His voice was calm, but there was something deeper in it, something uncertain. I told you I wouldn't force anything. You don't owe me, or her, anything. Michelle let out a dry chuckle, running a hand through her hair. Yeah, tell that to her. They both knew Stella had just made things infinitely more complicated. Michelle had always lived her life with the ability to walk away from anything and anyone. It was a survival instinct. She didn't form attachments because attachments could be taken away. And yet, here she was, feeling like she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't walk back from. I don't know how to do this, she admitted quietly. Lawrence studied her for a moment before responding. Neither do I. There was something raw in his voice, something that made her stomach twist. She turned away, walking toward the large window, staring out at the quiet landscape. The vast estate stretched far beyond what she could see, an endless expanse of manicured perfection that only made her feel more like she didn't belong. "This isn't my world," she muttered, more to herself than to him. She felt him move closer, though he didn't close the distance entirely. "Neither is hers," he said after a moment. "Not anymore." Michelle frowned, turning slightly. "What do you mean?" Lawrence's expression darkened just slightly, a flicker of something he quickly pushed back down. "This house, this life," he said carefully. "It's not the same without Emily. Stella doesn't respond to this place the way she used to. She doesn't respond to anyone." He paused, then added, "Until you." Michelle's throat tightened. "I don't know why." "Neither do I." They stood in silence, the weight of everything settling between them. Finally, Lawrence ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping just slightly. "Look, I meant what I said. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, but if you do decide to stay, I need you to understand something." Michelle turned fully, meeting his gaze. He exhaled. "If you leave now, before she gets too attached, maybe it won't hurt her." He hesitated. "But if you stay, and then walk away later, after she's already let you in." His voice trailed off, but she knew exactly what he was saying. She clenched her jaw, looking away. "You think I'm gonna hurt her? I think that if you don't know what you want, you shouldn't make her believe you do," he said quietly. That stung. Michelle wanted to snap back, to tell him he had no right to put this on her, to make her feel like she was responsible for something she had never asked for. But the truth was, she did feel responsible. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to calm down. "I don't know what I'm doing here, Lawrence." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But Stella does." That hit her harder than she wanted to admit, because he was right. Stella wasn't the one overthinking everything, questioning motives and second-guessing emotions. She was just a little girl who had been lost in the dark for too long. And for some reason, she had reached for Michelle, and Michelle didn't know how to walk away from that. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice quieter now. "I'll stay." Lawrence didn't react at first. He simply studied her, as if making sure she wasn't saying it just to appease him. Then, finally, he nodded. "Okay." It wasn't a binding contract. It wasn't a permanent agreement, but it was a start. And as Michelle stood there, feeling the weight of her decision settle into place, she realized that, for the first time in a long time, she had just made a choice that wasn't solely about survival. It was about something else entirely, and that scared her more than anything. The days that followed settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. Michelle still felt like an outsider, a guest in a life that didn't belong to her, but the unease she had carried that first night had started to fade. She spent most of her time with Stella, not because she had to, but because the little girl always seemed to find her. Whether it was in the sunlit reading nook by the windows or in the quiet corners of the garden, Stella would appear, watching her with cautious curiosity, waiting for Michelle to acknowledge her before stepping closer. And every time Michelle did, she had never considered herself particularly patient. Yet with Stella, it came naturally. She didn't try to force words out of her, didn't demand that she open up. She just existed beside her, and somehow, that was enough. One afternoon, as they sat outside beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree, Stella slowly slid a notebook toward Michelle. Michelle raised a brow. "For me?" Stella nodded, curious. She opened it, expecting a blank page. Instead, she found delicate, careful drawings. Flowers, trees, a small house with a single window lit up in yellow. Michelle smiled, flipping through the pages. "Did you draw all these?" Stella hesitated before nodding again. "They're really good," Michelle said, meaning it. "You've got talent, kid." A tiny flicker of pride crossed Stella's face. Michelle traced a finger over the page, her chest tightening. "You remind me of my mom," she murmured, more to herself than to Stella. "She used to draw too, all the time." Stella's fingers tightened slightly around her pencil, her expression unreadable. Michelle cleared her throat, shutting the notebook carefully. "Maybe you can teach me sometime. I was always terrible at drawing." My stick figures barely look like people. Stella's lips twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. Later that evening, Michelle found herself in the kitchen, absent-mindedly helping Julia chop vegetables for dinner. It was strange, how natural it felt, standing there like she belonged, despite knowing she didn't. Julia glanced at her with amusement. "I have to say, dear, you're settling in better than I expected," Michelle scoffed. "Don't get used to it. I'm still figuring things out." Julia nodded knowingly. "That's how it always starts." Michelle rolled her eyes but couldn't fight back the small smile tugging at her lips. Lawrence walked in then, sleeves rolled up, phone in hand. He looked tired, which was rare for him. He was the kind of man who always seemed in control, always composed. But tonight, there was something heavier in his expression. He set his phone down on the counter and ran a hand through his hair. Michelle glanced at him. Rough day at the Billionaires Club. Lawrence exhaled through his nose, smirking despite himself. "Something like that." Julia handed him a glass of whiskey without asking, and he took it gratefully, taking a slow sip before leaning against the counter. Michelle studied him for a moment, before deciding to just ask, "You gonna tell me what you found out?" His grip on the glass tightened, but his expression didn't waver. "I said I would," he replied. "Still waiting." Lawrence sighed, setting his drink down. "Not here." Michelle's stomach clenched. That didn't sound good. They moved to his office, the heavy doors closing behind them, sealing them in. Michelle had never been in here before. The room was lined with dark bookshelves, a massive desk sitting in the center, papers neatly arranged in a way that suggested someone who thrived on order. She crossed her arms, leaning against one of the chairs. "So," Lawrence exhaled, running a hand over his face before finally looking at her. "I had someone dig into your mother's past," he admitted, "and I found something you need to know." Michelle's throat went dry. "What?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "Your mother didn't just die in an accident," he said finally. "She was there, Michelle, the night of the crash that killed Emily." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lawrence held her gaze. "She was there, and she saved Stella's life." Michelle's pulse roared in her ears. That didn't make sense. None of this made sense. "My mom, she shook her head, trying to process. "That can't be right. She never even knew you." "I don't think that's true," Lawrence said quietly. Michelle's hands clenched at her sides. "No, there's no way. She wouldn't just..." She pulled Stella from the car before it caught fire. Lawrence interrupted gently. "The paramedics confirmed it. She was the one who saved her." Michelle felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, like everything she had ever known had just tilted sideways. "But why?" Lawrence exhaled. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Michelle's chest ached. Her mother had died that night. That much she had always known, but she had never known why she was there, why she had been anywhere near that crash. And now, the missing pieces were starting to come together in a way that terrified her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at Lawrence. "Did she say anything? Before she told the paramedics to give a message to her daughter," he said, his voice quieter now. Michelle's breath caught. Lawrence hesitated before saying the words that changed everything. She said, "Do good, even if no one sees." A shudder ran through Michelle because she knew those words. Her mother had always said them to her, as a child, as a teenager. Whenever Michelle had struggled to find her way, her mother had always reminded her of that simple truth. And now, those were the last words she had left behind. Michelle turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead as she tried to breathe. Lawrence stayed quiet, giving her the space to process. When she finally turned back around, her voice was steadier than she felt. "What does this mean?" Lawrence exhaled. "It means our lives were connected long before we ever met." Michelle's pulse pounded. Nothing would ever be the same again. The walls of Lawrence's office seemed to close in around Michelle. As the truth settled in, her mother had been there the night Emily died. She had saved Stella, and she had left a message meant for her. Words that Michelle had heard all her life, words that had once been a guiding light, but now felt like a ghost reaching out from the past. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring at nothing, her mind replaying the same questions over and over. Why was her mother at that crash? Did she know Emily? Did she know Lawrence? Had it been chance? Or was there something more? Her pulse pounded as she forced herself to meet his gaze. What else do you know? Lawrence studied her carefully before responding. Not much yet, but I'm looking. That's not good enough, she snapped, her voice tight, her emotions pushing past the carefully built walls she had spent years maintaining. I know, he said, his voice frustratingly calm. But this isn't something I can rush. There are gaps in the story, pieces missing. Michelle clenched her fists at her sides. You don't get it, do you? Her voice cracked, and she hated the way it made her sound vulnerable, like the ground beneath her was slipping. This isn't just some puzzle for you to solve. This is my mother, my life. Lawrence exhaled slowly, setting his glass down on the desk. I do get it. Michelle let out a humorless laugh. Right, because you're so good at dealing with things emotionally. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't bite back. Instead, he ran a hand over his face, looking as exhausted as she felt. I don't have all the answers, Michelle, but I promise you I'm going to find them. The sincerity in his voice made her want to believe him, but belief had never been something that came easy to her. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her brain. I need some air. Lawrence didn't stop her as she turned and walked out of the office, but she could feel his gaze on her, heavy with something she wasn't ready to name. She stepped outside into the crisp evening air, inhaling deeply. The garden stretched out in front of her, perfectly manicured, bathed in the soft glow of the outdoor lights. Everything about this place was too perfect, too controlled, just like Lawrence. And just like that, she felt it again, the weight of knowing that her life had somehow been tangled with his long before she had stepped into this house. A sound behind her made her turn. Stella stood in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her hand, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Michelle forced herself to push aside her turmoil, managing a small smile. Hey, kiddo. Couldn't sleep. Stella shook her head. Michelle crouched down so they were at eye level. Me neither. The little girl hesitated before stepping closer, her eyes searching Michelle's face. Michelle exhaled. Do you ever get that feeling? Like something big is happening and you don't know if you're ready for it? Stella didn't respond, but she didn't need to. There was understanding in her gaze, a quiet recognition that made Michelle's chest ache. After a moment, Stella reached out and took Michelle's hand, small and warm against hers. Michelle swallowed hard. It wasn't fair. Stella had already lost so much. She had already been through more than any child should ever have to endure, and now, Michelle was terrified that whatever truth was waiting for them on the other side of this mystery was going to break something neither of them could fix. But for now, she let herself hold Stella's hand, grounding herself in the one thing she knew for certain. She wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, she found herself in the library, pacing restlessly as she tried to make sense of everything. Julia walked in, carrying a tray of tea and pastries. Because of course she did. The woman had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was falling apart and needed something warm to hold. Thought you could use this, Julia said. Setting the tray down on the side table, Michelle sighed. Is it that obvious? Julia smiled knowingly. A little. Michelle ran a hand through her hair. How do you do it? Stay so calm when everything around you is unraveling. Julia chuckled, pouring tea into a delicate porcelain cup. Years of practice. And the knowledge that life has a way of revealing what we need to know, whether we're ready for it or not. Michelle sat down with a heavy sigh, taking the cup Julia offered her. I don't know if I want to know. Julia gave her a gentle look. Yes, you do. Otherwise, it wouldn't be eating at you like this. Michelle took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. What if I find out something I can't handle? Julia tilted her head. Then you handle it anyway, because that's what strong people do. Michelle let out a breath. She didn't feel strong. She felt like a fraud, like she was standing in a life that wasn't hers, waiting for it to collapse beneath her. But she also knew Julia was right. No matter what she found, she couldn't turn away. Not now. She set down her cup and stood, her resolve hardening. She needed answers, and she was going to find them. Michelle couldn't ignore it anymore. The questions, the missing pieces. The feeling that something had been kept from her for years. It was all clawing at the inside of her mind, refusing to let go. She had spent her whole life not knowing why her mother had died that night, why there had never been a clear explanation beyond the standard phrases people used for tragedies. Wrong place, wrong time, just an accident. But it wasn't just an accident. Not if Lawrence was right, not if her mother had been there. Saving Stella, leaving behind a message meant for Michelle. She needed to know the truth. That afternoon, while Lawrence was away handling business in the city, she found herself standing outside his office, her hands curled into fists at her sides. She had told herself she wouldn't snoop, that she would let him tell her everything when he was ready, but patience had never been her strong suit. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her pulse quickening as she took in the perfectly organized desk. The shelves lined with books and files, the quiet hum of a space that belonged to someone who controlled everything in his life, down to the last detail. Except for this. She moved toward the desk, scanning the surface. There was nothing out of place. No loose papers, no open folders. But then her eyes landed on a small locked drawer near the bottom. Instinct told her that whatever she was looking for was in there. She hesitated only for a second before pulling at the handle. Locked, of course. Frustration burned in her chest. She was about to give up when she noticed a key sitting on a nearby shelf, tucked behind a framed photo of Stella. She reached for it, her heart pounding as she slid it into the lock and turned. The drawer opened with a quiet click. Inside was a single file. Michelle pulled it out carefully, unfolding the documents with slightly trembling fingers. The first thing she saw was a photograph, a grainy image of a car wreck, flames still visible in the background. Debris scattered across the pavement. Her stomach twisted painfully. Beneath it were hospital records, police reports. She skimmed through them quickly, her mind racing. And then she found it, a witness statement. Her mother's name was printed at the top, clear as day. Michelle's breath caught as she read the words. I saw the crash happen. I pulled the little girl from the back seat before the flames reached her. I didn't see the driver until it was too late. The next line sent a shiver down Michelle's spine. It wasn't an accident. Someone forced them off the road. Her hand shook. Someone had forced them off the road. Her mother had known. She flipped the page, searching for more. But the report ended there. There was no further explanation. No follow-up investigation. Just a witness statement lost in the bureaucracy of paperwork. Her pulse roared in her ears. Had Lawrence seen this? Did he know? Before she could think. Before she could process, she heard footsteps approaching. She shoved the file back into the drawer, locked it, and returned the key to its place. Just as the door swung open, Lawrence stood there, his expression unreadable, his gaze flicking from her to the desk. Michelle forced herself to breathe. You were looking for something, he said, his voice measured. She crossed her arms, meeting his eyes. You're investigating my mother's death, but you didn't tell me that she thought it wasn't an accident. A flicker of something passed through his face. Guilt, maybe. I wasn't ready to tell you that, he admitted. Michelle clenched her jaw. You should have been, Lawrence exhaled, stepping further into the room. I don't have proof yet, just fragments of a story that doesn't make sense. She knew, Michelle said, her voice raw. She knew someone caused that crash, and no one did anything about it. His silence was answer enough. Michelle shook her head. You were there. You lost your wife in that crash. And you never thought to look deeper. Lawrence's jaw tightened. Of course I did. Then why is this the first time I'm hearing about it? Because I didn't find that report until recently, he said, his voice low. It was buried in old records. No one ever followed up on it. It was just forgotten. Michelle swallowed hard, her heart hammering. So you're saying someone wanted it to be forgotten? Lawrence didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. I think someone made sure it was. The weight of his words settled between them like a heavy fog. Michelle took a slow step back, shaking her head. Why? Why would someone do that? Lawrence's gaze darkened. That's what I'm trying to find out. A cold realization crept up her spine. If someone had forced that car off the road, if someone had wanted that crash to happen, then whoever it was had let her mother die, had left Stella motherless, had destroyed Lawrence's family in the blink of an eye. And now, years later, that same mystery was knocking on her door. Michelle's hands curled into fists. Then let's find out, she said, her voice steady. Lawrence studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. No more secrets, she added. If we're doing this, you tell me everything. His expression softened just slightly. Agreed. Michelle exhaled, steadying herself. She had spent years running from her past, avoiding the pain of what had happened. But now she was ready to face it, no matter what the truth turned out to be. Michelle barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the words from the witness statement echoed in her mind. It wasn't an accident. Someone forced them off the road. Her mother had known the truth, and for some reason, no one had listened. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with possibilities. Who had wanted that crash to happen? And why? By morning, exhaustion clung to her, but she forced herself to get up, to push past the fatigue. There was no time to waste. When she stepped into the kitchen, she found Lawrence already there, nursing a cup of coffee, his gaze distant for once. She didn't feel like making a sarcastic remark. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Where do we start?" He looked at her, his jaw tight, before sliding a file across the table. "I had someone dig deeper into the case," he said. "This is everything they could find." Michelle hesitated before flipping it open. There were more police reports, more official documents that all repeated the same conclusion: accidental crash, no evidence of foul play. But as she turned the pages, she noticed something odd. The original report from the night of the accident, the one that should have included statements from first responders, was missing. She frowned. "Where's the rest of it?" Lawrence exhaled, rubbing his temple. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. The initial report should be here, but it was never filed properly, or maybe someone made sure it wasn't." Michelle's fingers tightened around the paper. "This isn't just some mistake. Someone covered it up." Lawrence nodded. "That's what I think too." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the truth never came out. She turned another page and stopped when she saw a name she recognized. Detective Harold Connolly. Her pulse quickened. "I know this guy." Lawrence raised a brow. "How?" Michelle swallowed. "He was the officer who came to my house the night my mom died. He was the one who told me it was just an accident." Lawrence leaned forward. "And you're sure it was him?" "I never forget a face," she murmured, her grip on the file tightening. If Connolly had been involved in the case from the beginning, maybe he knew more than he had let on. Maybe he had been part of the cover-up. She looked up at Lawrence. "Where is he now?" "I already checked," he said. "He retired 5 years ago, moved upstate." Michelle's heart pounded. "We need to talk to him." Lawrence hesitated, studying her carefully. "You really want to go down this road?" She met his gaze. Unwavering. "I have to." For years, she had accepted the version of events she had been given, but now she knew better, and if there was even a chance that Connolly had answers, she was going to get them. Lawrence exhaled. "All right, I'll make the arrangements." A few hours later, they were in the car. Heading out of the city, the drive was quiet, tense. Michelle stared out the window, watching the scenery blur past, her thoughts tangled in the past. She had spent so long running from this, from the pain, from the unknown. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of away from it. Lawrence's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "When we get there, let me take the lead," he said. Michelle glanced at him. "Why?" "Because if he's hiding something, he won't give it up easily. We need to be careful." Michelle clenched her jaw but nodded. She wasn't used to letting someone else take control. But this wasn't about pride. It was about getting the truth. They pulled up to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing about it stood out. Just an ordinary place on an ordinary street. But Michelle knew better. Connolly had been there that night, and he was the only person who might know why her mother had died. Lawrence stepped out first, and Michelle followed, her heart beat loud in her ears as they walked up to the door. He knocked, firm and deliberate. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing a man in his 60s, his hair graying, his expression wary. "Detective Connolly?" Lawrence asked. The older man's eyes flickered between them before settling on Michelle. Recognition sparked in his gaze. "You," he murmured. Michelle stiffened. He remembered her. Lawrence stepped forward. "We need to talk." Connolly hesitated, then exhaled heavily, stepping aside. "Come in." The inside of the house was cluttered but lived in, the walls lined with old photographs and memorabilia from his time on the force. He led them to the living room and sat down, rubbing his hands together. "I knew this day would come," he admitted. Michelle's stomach twisted. She exchanged a glance with Lawrence before sitting across from him. "Then why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" Connolly sighed, leaning back. "Because I was warned not to." The air in the room shifted. Michelle's hands curled into fists. "By who?" The old detective hesitated, then looked straight at Lawrence. "Your wife's family." A stunned silence filled the room. Michelle's breath caught. Emily's family. Lawrence's face was unreadable, but his grip on the armrest of his chair tightened. "What do they have to do with this?" Connolly let out a slow breath. "Everything." Michelle felt the ground beneath her shift. She had been searching for answers about her mother's death, but now, it seemed, she had stumbled onto something much bigger, something that had been buried for years, and she had a feeling they were only just beginning to uncover the truth. The air inside Connolly's house grew unbearably thick, pressing down on Michelle's chest like an invisible weight. She had walked in expecting answers about her mother's death, but now she felt like she was standing on the edge of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. Emily's family. Those words echoed in her head, refusing to settle. Lawrence sat stiffly beside her, his expression unreadable but his body tense, his grip on the armrest of the chair just a little too tight. She'd never seen him like this before. So still, so controlled, yet radiating an almost dangerous quietness. He exhaled, measured and slow, before finally speaking. "Explain." Connolly rubbed a hand over his face, a tired man weighed down by regrets. Back when the crash happened, there were complications. His voice was steady, but Michelle could hear the hesitation in it. He was still deciding how much to say. She wasn't in the mood for patience. "Complications," she pressed, leaning forward. "Or a cover-up?" The detective sighed. "Both." He shifted in his seat, his gaze flicking between them. At first, everything was by the book. The accident was reported. Emergency responders arrived. Statements were taken. But then, before the investigation could move forward, pressure started coming down from above. Michelle frowned. "From who?" Connolly hesitated for just a second too long. Lawrence caught it instantly. "From Emily's family?" The detective nodded. "They wanted the case closed, fast, no questions asked." Michelle felt her pulse quicken. "Why would they do that?" Connolly exhaled. "Because they knew it wasn't an accident." The words landed like a bomb. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. Lawrence's face remained unreadable, but his hand curled into a fist against his knee. "That doesn't make sense," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Emily's parents loved her. They were devastated when she died." Connolly gave him a sad look. "Love and secrets aren't mutually exclusive, son." Michelle's mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. "They knew," she murmured, almost to herself. "They knew someone forced them off the road, and instead of finding out who, they buried it." Connolly leaned forward. "Or they already knew who it was." The implication sent an icy chill down Michelle's spine. She turned to Lawrence, watching him carefully. "Did Emily ever mention anything? Ever seem like she was worried about something before the accident?" Lawrence shook his head, but his gaze was distant, as if searching his memory for anything that could have been a sign. "No," he said finally. "She never—" He stopped. Michelle caught the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "What?" he exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "A few days before she died, she got a phone call. It upset her. I asked her about it, but she brushed it off. Said it was nothing." He clenched his jaw. "I should have pushed harder." Michelle swallowed. "Do you know who called her?" Lawrence shook his head. "No, but if what Connolly is saying is true, then maybe she knew something she wasn't supposed to." Michelle exhaled slowly, trying to steady her thoughts. "And whoever wanted her gone made sure of it." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of it all settling over them. Finally, Michelle looked back at Connolly. "You said someone forced them off the road. Do you know who?" The old detective hesitated, and for a second, Michelle thought he might not answer. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't know for sure, but there was a name that came up a few times during the early investigation, before everything was shut down." Michelle leaned in. "Who?" Connolly's gaze darkened. "Vincent Holloway." The name sent a shiver down her spine. It meant nothing to her. but the way Lawrence stiffened told her everything she needed to know. She turned to him. "You know who that is?" His expression didn't change, but his voice was cold when he said, "Yes." Michelle waited, but he didn't elaborate. Connolly let out a tired breath. "I don't have proof of anything. But if you're looking for answers, that's where I'd start." Michelle swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. "Where can we find him?" Connolly shook his head. "No one's seen him in years. He disappeared after the crash. Some say he left the country. Others say he's dead," he exhaled. "But if he's alive, someone knows where he is." Lawrence stood abruptly, his movements tense, controlled. "Then I'll find him." Michelle followed suit, still trying to catch up to everything that had just been dropped on them. "And when we do," Lawrence turned to her, his expression unreadable, "then we find out the truth." Michelle nodded, but inside, she felt anything but certain. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. This was about something bigger, something dangerous, and she had the sinking feeling that once they found Vincent Holloway, there would be no turning back. The drive back to the city was silent. Lawrence gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched as if lost in his own thoughts. Michelle stared out the window, trying to process everything. "Who is he?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Lawrence didn't look at her. "He worked for my father-in-law." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "So you think—" "I don't know," Lawrence cut in. "But I intend to find out." She exhaled slowly, her mind reeling. If Emily's family had been involved in covering up the truth, then that meant her mother had died for nothing. No, not nothing. She had died protecting Stella. Michelle swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let her mother's death be just another forgotten tragedy. She was going to find Vincent Holloway, and she was going to make sure the truth finally came to light. The city lights blurred as Lawrence maneuvered the car through the streets, his grip on the steering wheel tighter than usual. Michelle sat beside him, her mind racing just as fast as the world outside the window. The name Vincent Holloway pulsed in her head like a warning bell, a ghost from the past that neither of them had seen coming. She had never heard of him before today, yet somehow he was at the center of everything. Her mother's death, Emily's accident, the cover-up that had kept them all in the dark for years, and Lawrence, for all his control, knew exactly who he was. Michelle couldn't let that slide. "You still haven't told me," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "Who is he? What did he do for Emily's father?" Lawrence's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on the road, but she saw the flicker of something dark beneath his composed exterior. He was the kind of man who handled problems. Michelle narrowed her eyes. "What kind of problems?" Lawrence exhaled. "The kind that required silence permanently." The weight of his words sank deep into her bones. "So you think he was the one who—" "I don't think," Lawrence interrupted, his voice sharp. "I know." Michelle's stomach turned. "How?" Lawrence hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Years ago, when I first married Emily, I knew her family had influence, power, but I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. I was just a businessman, not part of their world." He tightened his grip on the wheel. "But after she died, I started looking into things, and Holloway's name kept coming up. He disappeared right after the crash. That wasn't coincidence." Michelle exhaled slowly, trying to keep her thoughts straight. "So you think Emily's father had something to do with it?" Lawrence's voice was quieter now. "I think he knew more than he let on." The realization sent a shiver down Michelle's spine. "And my mother, if she saw something that night," Lawrence said, his voice tight, "then she wasn't just a bystander. She was a witness." Michelle felt a lump form in her throat. That was why the case had been buried, why no one had ever looked deeper. Her mother hadn't just been an unfortunate casualty, she had been a threat. Michelle clenched her fists. "We have to find Holloway." Lawrence gave a curt nod. "I already have someone working on it." The next day, Michelle paced the length of the guest house, restless and unable to shake the tension coiling in her chest. Stella had been watching her, quiet as ever, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her small hands. Finally, the little girl stood and walked over to her, pressing the soft fabric of the rabbit into Michelle's hands. Michelle blinked. "For me?" Stella nodded. Michelle swallowed hard, gripping the worn toy. Thanks, kiddo. She had no idea how much Stella understood, but somehow, the little girl always seemed to know when Michelle needed something, even if she didn't say it. Lawrence appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the space effortlessly. His gaze flicked to Stella before settling on Michelle. "We found him," he said simply. Michelle's heart pounded. She set the rabbit down carefully, brushing a hand over Stella's hair before straightening. "Where?" Lawrence's expression darkened. "A cabin upstate, isolated. He's been hiding for years." Michelle didn't hesitate. "Then let's go." The drive stretched on, the air between them thick with anticipation. Michelle could feel the shift in Lawrence. His usual quiet control was still there, but beneath it was something else, something more raw. They pulled up to the secluded cabin just as the sun began to set. The woods surrounded it like a fortress, the air still, heavy with the weight of secrets waiting to be unearthed. Lawrence killed the engine, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a word, they stepped out. Michelle's heart pounded as they approached the door. Lawrence knocked, his touch firm, deliberate, for a long time. Nothing happened then. Finally, the door creaked open. A man stood there, older now, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that only came from running for too long. His sharp eyes flicked between them, landing on Lawrence first, then Michelle. Recognition sparked. "You shouldn't be here," Vincent Holloway said. His voice rough from years of silence. Michelle stepped forward. "But we are." Holloway studied her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. Then he sighed, stepping back. "Come in." The cabin was sparse, nothing more than the bare necessities. It looked like a place someone lived in when they had nowhere else to go. Holloway settled into a chair, watching them warily. "So," he said, "you finally came looking for me?" Lawrence remained standing, his posture rigid. "You know why we're here?" Holloway exhaled. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." Michelle's pulse thundered. "Tell us the truth." Holloway leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're not gonna like it." Michelle's voice was firm. "We don't care." Holloway studied her, then nodded. "All right." He let out a slow breath. "Your mother was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She saw what happened. She knew too much. And when she pulled that little girl out of the car, she signed her own death sentence." Michelle's chest constricted. "So it wasn't just the crash. Someone made sure." Holloway's expression darkened. "Yeah." Michelle swallowed hard. "Who?" Holloway hesitated. Then, finally, he said the name that made everything fall into place. "Emily's father." The words crashed over them like a tidal wave. Michelle's breath caught. Lawrence's face remained unreadable, but his hands curled into fists at his sides. Holloway exhaled. He couldn't risk your mother talking. He couldn't risk anyone finding out what really happened. So he made sure she didn't. His gaze sharpened. "And now that you're digging, he's going to come after you too." The warning sent ice through Michelle's veins. Lawrence's voice was like steel. "Let him try." Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't get it, do you? He's not just some rich old man. He's got power, connections, people willing to do whatever he asks. You're opening a door you might not be able to close." Michelle met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "Then I'll burn the whole house down." Holloway studied her for a long moment, before shaking his head, almost like he pitied her. "You're just like her, you know," he muttered. "Your mother." Michelle's chest ached, but she ignored it, because there was no turning back now. They had the truth, and now, they had to decide what to do with it.